Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for organizing this conference. And welcome to the last talk of the day. I hope you're not too tired already. And I'm very happy to present my paper, A Dynamic Framework of School Choice, which is a joint work with Minseon, my friend and co-author, who's going to be on the market this year. So let me start with the introduction. School choice is a tool of assigning students to schools based on and respecting their choices, right? And worldwide, many jurisdictions have implemented market design-based school choice at various levels of education. For example, in New York City, the school choice starts as early as for 3Ks, pre-Ks, kindergarten, elementary, and middle high schools. And briefly speaking, the market design-based school choice operates through a choice mechanism, which takes two main inputs. The first one is the students' applications to schools, and the second one is how schools rank their applications. And taking these two inputs, the mechanism produces an assignment for each student. And our main motivation of the paper is the sequential nature of school choice. The fact that students face school choice multiple times throughout their academic life directly implies that these choices are closely related to each other. However, the sequential nature of school choice has been neglected by both scholars and the policymakers. First of all, no existing studies really examine directly the sequential nature of school choice, and hence we don't have a right framework to study it, and also we don't have a good empirical evidence of it. And second, the policymakers also neglected this feature when talking about a very conspicuous problem, racial segregation across schools. And the admissions reforms mostly have targeted each level of education separately without considering how intervening at one level may or may be affected by other stages. And let's talk about that in the context of racial segregation across high schools. And as I told you, most existing policies have only targeted high school admissions by some sort of an affirmative action policy. However, it could be that the segregation pattern develops much earlier, for example, in the middle school choice stage, that any high school only admissions reform will fail to address this type of issue. So the research questions we ask in this paper are twofold. First, does the student's previous school choice affect the subsequent choices of the students? And second, can we use this relationship to understand and address the segregation problem across schools? And by answering these two questions, we aim to first develop a novel dynamic framework of school choice. And using this framework, we want to provide a new insight into how we should understand and address segregation. The context we'll be studying is the New York City public middle and high school choices. And we use the student level application data, focusing on the cohort that applied to middle schools in 2014 to 15, and then to high schools 3 years later. The New York City uses the student proposing Gale-Shapley's deferred acceptance for DA algorithm. And it's worth to mention that the school priority rules used in this context is pre-specified and consists of two layers. First, each school divides their applicants into few groups, what we call the priority groups. But this number of priority group is much smaller than the number of applicants, and hence there are ties at oftentimes. And there is a single tie-breaking lottery to break this. So let me give you what we do in this paper first. We start by providing an empirical evidence of causal effects of middle schools the students attended on their high school applications and assignments. To do so, we make use of the randomness in the middle school assignments generated by the tie-breaking rules that I just talked about. And in the second part of the paper, based on the first part evidence, we build and estimate a dynamic model of school choice. And to do so, we make use of the dynamic discrete choice framework, combine that with large market matching theory to model the dynamics of the school choice. And then using the model, we also want to decompose the middle school's effects on the high school assignment outcomes into two possible channels. First, how middle schools can affect the students' applications to high schools, which was the first input to the school choice. And second, how the middle school students attended can impact how high schools rank the applicants. And using the estimated model, in the final part of the paper, we move on to a counterfactual analysis to study the concurrent admissions reforms in New York City. Specifically, we study the effects of the admissions reforms on segregation when these reforms are implemented at alternative times. And then let me give you what we find. First, we find that the middle school students attended do impact their tastes on high schools that underlie their high school applications. Attending a middle school with higher quality makes students value the quality of the high schools even more. And attending a middle school with lots of same-race students makes them want to be with more same-race students in high school. And these taste changes have an actual impact on their high school assignment outcomes by affecting the students' applications to high school. By the decomposition exercise, we find that the impact of middle schools on high school choice outcomes mainly operate by affecting the students' applications. So these first two findings suggest both the challenge as well as the potential solutions that the policymakers face to address segregation. The challenge is that segregation has a reinforcing effect. And let's say the middle schools are already segregated, then that will change the students' taste toward high schools, toward more segregation. And these taste changes will actually impact their high school assignments in a direction that contributes to segregation. However, the potential solution that we suggest and suggested by these findings is that we might be able to address segregation in high schools by intervening early, say, reforming the middle school admission. And that is what we quantify in the last part of the paper. And by the counterfactual analysis, we find that the middle school only admissions reform can desegregate first the middle schools, obviously, but also through the effect that we have found, high schools as well. And so the policy implication of our paper is going to be that this dynamic relationship of the school choices can be used to design more effective policies. Okay, let me skip the related literature part for the time. And let me just give you some institutional backgrounds of the empirical context we studied. And this is the same figure I showed you in the first slide. And it's useful to use this framework to explain how things work in New York City. First of all, the students' applications to schools are the rank or the list of the schools, right? And the school priority rules are pre-specified and, again, consist of two layers. First one is the intrinsic priority groups. For example, as a school, I can give my first priority to applicants who live in Manhattan. And then the second priority to students who attended an information session. And as I talked about it earlier, naturally there are ties among applicants who belong to the same priority. And in that case, the tiebreaker comes into play to break ties within the same priority group. For example, the use of lotteries, and sometimes the use of test scores. Finally, the mechanism used in New York City, again, is the Gale-Shockley deferred acceptance. Okay. The data. We use the student application data that using the cohort applied to middle schools in 2014 to 15, and then to 3 high schools 3 years later. We have data on their basic observable demographics, such as ethnicity, their performance at the New York statewide standardized examinations, and also where they live. And for the school level data, we use the Department of Education's middle and high school directories, which are basically books that are published every year before the admission process takes place. And it includes some basic information about the schools and what's the admission criteria used for each school, the number of seats, so on and so forth. Throughout the paper, I'm going to use two definitions of groups of schools. Okay? The first one is what we call the high achievement schools, defined by the top third in terms of the fraction of high performers in terms of their standardized test scores. The second group is what we call the high minority schools, similarly defined, but in terms of the proportion of Black or Hispanic students. Okay. And let me show you some summary statistics of the schools. So here in this table, I'm showing you the middle school characteristics in panel A and the high school characteristics in panel B. And column 1 and 2 are about all schools in our sample, and columns 3, 4, and 5, 6 are about the groups of schools that I just defined in the previous slide. What I want you to focus on this table is the last 2 rows. In the last 2 rows of this table, I'm showing you the fraction of students enrolled in each type of high school that are from each type of middle school. And what we can see is a high correlation, positive correlation. For example, if you look at the fraction of students coming from a high achievement middle school, because of how we defined it, on average, about 30% are from high achievement middle schools. However, when we look at high achievement high schools, the fraction is nearly double. So this pattern suggests 2 things. First, students might have very consistent tastes over middle and high schools, so that's the reason why we're seeing such a positive correlation. Or second, the middle schools they attended might be playing some role in the high school application in the science. And we aim to distinguish these two throughout the page. Okay, so here's how the rest of the talk will go. First, I'm going to talk about the first part of the paper, about the reduced form evidence. And then I'll move on to the structural model and describe how we estimate and how we use the estimated model. Okay. Here in this section, we provide evidence of middle school's causal effects on high school application and assignments. Specifically, we estimate the treatment effects of attending different types of groups of middle schools on what kind of high schools they apply to and what kind of high schools they are assigned to. And you might already think that, well, here there's certainly going to be an omitted variable bias because my treatment variable, attending some group of middle school, itself is a result of students' middle school choice. So if there's any uncontrolled unobservable factor that both affects the middle and high school choices, we'll suffer from omitted variable. And to overcome this problem, we use the quasi-experimental feature built in the centralized assignment mechanism using the framework of Abdelkabroglu, English, Nartan, that basically uses the tie-breaking feature of the admission system. So let me directly give you what we find by estimating the treatment effects. And here, we're trying to answer the first research question. Does a student's previous school, here in the middle school, affect the student's subsequent high school choice? First of all, when we look at the high school application, the answer is yes. And we find that the students who attended high achievement middle schools applied to higher quality high schools. And then what about assignments then? When we look at the high school assignment results, the answer is also yes. But what we have is a larger magnitude in terms of the treatment effect. And we interpret these as follows. So, okay, so by attending a high quality middle school, they apply to better high schools. But in order for me to account for this larger magnitude, there must be something going on from the high school side as well. Because again, in a school choice context, assignment is determined not only by the application, but also by how schools rank the applications. And this possibility is actually going to build in our structural model, which will follow in the next section. Do you have any questions so far? Yeah.
So you show, I think, the high achievement and low achievement, but You said there are two types of tiebreakers, right? Like notary, and the other one is, what is this? Test score?
Test scores.
Are there systematic differences between these high achievement and non-high achievement schools in terms of using the tiebreaker or the other one? I wonder if there is any mechanical thing here also of the high achievement students getting into high achievement middle schools because there is a selection process basically that places them there.
Yeah, that's good. So what I can tell you is that high achievement middle schools, they are more likely to be using test scores for tiebreaking, first of all, because these are like screening programs that actually screen students. And the mechanical worry that you had, can you explain that?
It's that, it's basically that. So I suppose that in the model you're gonna have the both, right? The tiebreaker, the random one, and the other. So you're gonna control for that. But we can talk about that later.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Okay, let me move on to the main section of the paper. Okay. So here, before getting to like Greek letters and equations, let me tell you how our model looked like using figures. The model is a two-period model where the first period corresponds to middle school choice and the second period corresponds to the high school. Since this is a finite model, I'll start from period 2. And in period 2, high school assignment is again determined by the students' applications to high schools and how high schools rank their applications. And we assume each student have a utility over the high school characteristics that underlie their rank order list, their applications. And that is as a function of their own demographics when they apply to high schools, distance to each school, and some unobservable taste on high school characteristics. But most importantly, we allow this utility to be dependent on the middle school they attended. And moving back one period, the structure of the first period is almost identical to the second period. Now then, let me tell you how we model the middle school's effects on the high school. And the first channel is what we call the student application channel. And namely, the middle school students attended can impact the high school utilities that underlie the students' high school applications. First of all, we allow the middle schools to affect the students' characteristics, namely test scores, right? We know from the past literature that if a student herself is a high performer, then she values the quality of the high schools more. And by attending different middle schools, students might have different end of middle school test scores, which can impact their utilities on high school through this way. And we allow for this. And second, there are many other things that can be affected by the middle school's attending. For example, information could be affected. There could be really the pure taste changes on high schools. But unfortunately, we don't have data to distinguish all these possibilities. So what we do instead is to include the middle school directly into the utility function to affect the students' high school, which will become clearer in about 3 slides. Okay.
Yes. Question. Do you include in your variables on the right-hand side the school that they would have taken as a backup if they didn't get into the school they actually went to? Because that's an expression of their preferences that you could use to put students into buckets that are similar.
Like a backup school, for instance?
So let's say that you have 2 students and there's a random choice. A random decision is made to allow one student to go to a very academic middle school. It seems like what you would want to do is condition on the school that student that got into the academic school went to, but condition on the school he chose as the second choice. Because you have the students who also chose that academic school as their first choice, who didn't get in, and they went to their second choice school. So if you're looking for a fair comparison, you compare the second choice with the second choice, and then condition on the, or hold the second choice as constant, and then condition on the school you actually went to.
So maybe I'm not totally understanding. So you're telling me that I should conditional on, say, going to the same second ranked schools, then compare the outcomes?
Well, let's say I apply to an academic school, but I don't get in. And my backup school is school A. And there are two other kids that apply to the academic school and they both get in. But one of them shows school A as their backup and one of them shows school B as their backup. It seems like you should compare me with the person who chose A as the backup, because he would be somewhat more similar to me in terms of other characteristics you're trying to control for.
Yeah, I get that point. But since we are again using the tie-breaking system, so basically what I'm going to do is to compare two students. These two students have the same priorities at the high school and apply to, say, good middle school. Sorry, about middle school priorities and apply to a good middle school. But by the tie-breaking, the first student got into it, but the second student didn't get it. And since these difference in terms of middle school assignment was because of the lottery, the tiebreaker, we are actually free of those kind of omitted variable bias, if you're worried about those things. If that wasn't clear, we can talk about it.
Maybe a related question is there going to be a empirical approach to distinguishing the middle school attended from the unobserved case and the high school choice? Because presumably your unobserved case are related middle school and high school.
Yeah.
And is there a way to distinguish estimate the causal effect of middle school attended separately from this persistent preferences across the two?
Yeah. So our
two time periods.
Yeah, so our model's ability to identify the middle school's effects on the high school utility will be coming from two sources. First of all, we assume a distributional assumption on the unobservable case. So there is no non-parametric identification of the unobservable case of each student. And the second, we implicitly are using the quasi-random assignments to middle schools that I just used in the first part of the paper. So because of those two things, we are able to identify the middle school effects.
So I guess that one thing you found is to tell us why there is no control, or if there is a control for the rank order list that you submitted in the middle school choice for the final outcomes or final assignment, because in a way that will be your type, will be your priority and the rank order list in the first school choice problem, right? So if you are controlling for that, then I think that you're doing exactly the contrast that Kairo was thinking about. If you're not, then probably you're not.
So the variation again is coming from the tie-breaking. And if I understood you correctly, then what you're trying to say is that I must control for the pair of application and priority in the middle schools because there's essentially the text. Well, so that is implicitly used, but we can talk about more in detail afterwards. Okay, the second channel, how we model the middle school's effects on the high school choice is what we call the priority channel. And the middle school students attended can impact the students' priorities at each high school. First of all, again, the test scores. By attending different middle schools, students will have different end of middle school test scores, which is going to make the students to have different admission chances at high schools that use test scores for admissions. And the second one is because of the priority group rule. And the mostly used priority group rule in New York City is what is the geographic criteria. And each school can give the student priority if that student lived in a certain neighborhood or went to a middle school in such neighborhood. So by attending middle schools can have impact on the students' high school priorities. Third, we allow the unobservable taste on each period to be serially correlated. And finally, we assume the students are forward-looking so that when they apply to middle schools, they take these potential effects on their eventual high school assignment outcomes into consideration. Okay? Okay, so more details about them.
Can I ask a question just on that framework? So you have to clear both of these markets, right? And your counterfactual focus and not working.
So you have to clear both of these markets, right? In your counterfactuals, the stage 1 market and the stage 2 markets. So, some of the schools in New York hypothesis not based on test scores, right? screen schools do that quite a bit. So how do you model their demand over the students? Do you estimate that demand as well?
Yeah, we estimate that demand so specifically we take all the screening programs in middle schools, let's say, or high school, doesn't matter. We take the data, applicant data in our hands, and then we have information on how each screening program runs the students. So basically what we do is we estimate a latent utility that we assume each screening program to have on the applicants and use that estimate to produce a counterfactual demand. Okay, so starting from the second period again, in the high school of choice stage, we assume student I has utility B, Ij, from attending a high school program J. Again, as a function of the high school characteristics, their own demographics, distance to each high school, unobservable based on high schools, and most importantly, the middle schools they attended. Okay? And the first period utility, we assume the student I has utility UIM over middle schools, which consists of two parts. The first part is the flow utility, or the instantaneous utility of attending middle school M. And the second part is the continuation value of middle school M. And to interpret the school choice data in our hand, we impose a behavioral assumption such that in each period, the students' rank, submitted rank order list are such that the resulting outcome is ex post stable. And what is ex post stable? Well, the DA produces cutoffs in terms of the ex post priority scores of each student, where the priority score is basically the sum of the intrinsic priority group and the tiebreaker. And what ex post stability means is that each student is assigned to their favorite ex post feasible school. And by assuming ex post stability, basically I'm being agnostic about the exact strategies employed by the students, because ex post stability is about outcomes, not strategies. And ex post stability is not only consistent with the truth-telling behavior, which is the transitional assumption used in the literature, but also with, for example, the expected utility maximizing behavior or more robust assumptions on student behaviors that allow for approximately optimal behavior as well. Okay, so now let's talk about the continuation value of a middle school M. And to talk about that, let's define one random variable, omega, which is the source of uncertainty in this context. It determines both the expelled scores of the students and hence the cutoffs of each high school. For example, it'll be the realization of the lottery draw in our context. And using this omega, let's define an ex post feasible set of high schools when students I attended middle school M, given the lottery realization omega. And what ex post stability tells us is that if a student I attended middle school M, given the lottery realization omega in high school, the student's second period assignment is going to be the best school in the ex post feasible set of high schools. And hence the utility or the payoff from it will be equal to the maximum of the high school utility of Bij over the ex post feasible set of high schools. And using this formulation, we can write down the continuation value as follows, which is the expectation of the second period payoff, conditional on what the student knows in the first period with respect to what will be realized in the second period. Okay. And let me tell you how we parameterize the model. So basically it's a random coefficient model. And we assume that the flow payoffs, first of all, are linear in parameters. And we allow students to have heterogeneous case on the school characteristics, both for middle schools and high schools. You can see it by the subscript I, right? And then how does this heterogeneous case parameter look like? So first of all, this is the heterogeneous case of student I on middle school characteristic, which consists of three parts. First of all, the beta 0M is the common taste to all students. And the second part is essentially an interaction term, which allows students with different observable characteristics to have different tastes on middle school. And finally, gamma IM is the unobservable taste on middle school. Yeah.
Sorry for jumping ahead, but if you think of the flow chaos for the high schools, you mentioned the middle school can have two direct effects. One is that it changes these coefficients, and the other is it changes one of these x's. So if you're going to condition on all these propensity scores, you kind of have like one instrument, which is the assignment to middle school. It's kind of being used for to identify two things. Am I kind of off base here? I'm missing like kind of one identification step where one ID, but you're estimating, we can identify a bunch of coefficients.
So the coefficient on the student's observable characteristics, basically the test scores, we take a simplified assumption and actually estimate the value-added model, which is very simple based on the selection on observables assumption, and then use the estimated coefficients on it. So that's how we circumvent the identification problem. It is a simplification, but at this moment, the paper is at this stage, okay? And next, the heterogeneous taste on the high school characteristics look very similar, except for this last term. And this last term is what we call the middle school type effect. And basically, by staring at this equation, what we're doing here is that depending on the student's middle school MI's type tau, we're allowing students to have different mean taste over the high school characteristics. And finally, we assume that the observable taste in first period and the second period are as governed like this. R0 is the matrix that governs the serial correlation. Okay, again, to estimate the model, we use the exposability as the key assumption. And because of exposability, we basically can interpret the school choice data in our hand as a conditional logit model, where logit is coming from our assumption, distributional assumption on the idiosyncratic preferences, where the student's conditional choice set is the exposed feasible set of schools, and the student's choice is the assigned school that we observe in the data. We estimate the model using a simulated maximum likelihood and focus on the subsample of Staten Islands for attractability. Staten Island is one of the 5 boroughs in New York City, and actually it's an island and can be considered as an independent school district because a very small fraction of students come in outside of Staten Island. Yeah.
So I can also one part. So for in the empirical section, we do the research design, it's market design, so, right? You condition by the rank order list and the propensity score implied by the rank order list priorities to get the causal, right?
Yeah.
But here, then maybe it's similar to coming back to the same questions, like in the exposability for identifying preferences in the structural model, you're using the allocation, right? So you are not using the rank order list, or you are using it. In any way. Are you using the rank order list in the estimation in any way?
No, we don't explicitly control for it.
So is it possible to use the causal estimates that you got in the empirical strategy or in some way use the information? Because basically, kind of like the identification strategy that you show in the empirical section is kind of like calling for using it. Right? Is it possible to use at least that
one thing I can quickly think about is like generating moments to match, for example.
For instance,
that's actually a very good suggestion. Let's talk after. Thank you. Yeah, and let me give you the main findings. First of all, we will confirm that the middle school students attend impact how students value the high school characteristics. First, attending high achievement middle schools make the students value of the quality of the high schools more. And also, attending high minority middle schools makes students want to be with less white students in high school. And I'm going to try to convince you that this means that segregation has a reinforcing effect. First of all, in terms of academic segregation, I think it's kind of intuitive. If you go to a good middle school with many good middle school students, and the student wants to go to an even better high school, and this creates a segregation in terms of academic performance. And in terms of racial segregation, we actually find the significance and the sign of this finding, this coefficient, is actually robust across different racial groups. So a Black Hispanic student who went to a high minority middle school with lots of Black or Hispanic kids want to be with more Black Hispanic kids in high school. And for white Asian students who went to a low minority middle school with lots of white Asian students, now wants to be with more white and Asian students. Okay. And second, by the decomposition exercise, we find that the application channel is quantitatively more important. In other words, in the middle school's effects on the high school choice outcomes, we find that the change mainly operates by affecting the students' applications to high schools, rather than their priorities at the test. Okay. Till when do I have? 5:21? You're good? Okay. So let me move on to the last part of the paper. And in the last part of the paper, we use the estimated model to talk about counterfactuals about segregation. And New York City public schools are extremely racially segregated. And to overcome this segregation problem, recently, the city has announced two admission reforms. First, to remove the geographic-based priority rules, and second, to remove the screening based on test scores. And both of these are known to be contributing to segregation, right? And what we do is basically combine these two policies and evaluate the effect of those two combined when the policy reform is implemented at alternative times. And so specifically, we consider three alternative times. First, we only reform the middle school admissions. Second, we only reform the high school admissions. And third, we combine both middle and high school admissions. Okay. So to talk about the segregation pattern, I'll be using this measure, which is the racial gap in the characteristics of cosine peers between Black Hispanic versus white and Asian students. The first finding is that the middle school only admissions reform can desegregate middle schools intuitively, right? So here, I'm plotting the racial gap in terms of the fraction of Black or Hispanic students together, assigned together with me between the Black Hispanic group and the white Asian group. So in the current regime, we see that Black Hispanic students are much more likely to be assigned together with Black or Hispanic students. And by reforming the middle school admissions, we can see this gap drops by 42%. So, okay, middle school admissions reform is meant to desegregate middle school, and it's working. However, what we additionally find is that this desegregation of middle schools through the effects of middle schools on high school choice can also desegregate high schools to a certain degree. In the right panel, I'm showing you the same graph as before, but now this is about the high school choice outcome. And what we see is that the middle school only admissions reform, MS, even though we haven't touched anything about the high school admissions, can desegregate high schools as well. And second, by combining the middle and high school admissions reform, we find a larger effect than reforming only the high school admissions, which is a nice transition to our policy implication. And after this, I will conclude. And this is the same figure again, used in the first slide. School choice outcome, student school matching, is an equilibrium outcome determined by both the demand, the students' applications, and supply, how schools select the students. And so far, most existing policies focus reforming just the supply side. In other words, admissions reform, because probably it was easier for the policymakers to target the admissions reform instead of trying to affect the students' applications. And what we're suggesting in this paper is that an early intervention on the supply side, the middle school admissions reform, can alter the subsequent demand side behaviors of the students, the high school applications. And hence, this dynamic relationship can be used to design more effective policies when we talk about segregation. I skipped the conclusion, and thank you so much for staying on.